Good morning to our friends in the Americas. Good morning to our friends in Europe. I should say good afternoon to our friends in Europe and good evening to our friends in Asia. Welcome to the Virtual Snow Science Workshop 2020. We're very excited to be hosting this event live from Fernie. And we'll see if this works. We've just been treated to the most amazing early morning scene in Fernie. If I put my screen up, you can see the moon. The moon is just going to be leaving us, and the sun's just in the process of rising. It's absolutely stunning. And for those of you who don't know Fernie, Fernie's a mountain town in southeastern British Columbia in Western Canada. Fernie's endowed with incredible scenic beauty, as I hope you can see from the window outside. And it offers a huge range of outdoor activities for all seasons. Mountain biking is phenomenal right now, and some of us have been sneaking out for some rides during the run up to this event. However, it's starting to feel as though the seasons are changing a little bit, and it's not going to be too long until the snow starts to fall. And of course, Fernie is famous for its amazing powder snow, which makes a great connection to the subject matter of this conference, snow science and avalanche practice. We're running this conference live, and we're hoping as many of you as possible will tune in for the presentations, panel discussions, and poster sessions at the advertised time. It's definitely the way to get the most out of the VSSW, because that way you get a chance to be directly involved. You can ask questions, you can make comments, you can even meet the poster presenters in virtual meeting rooms. We've tried really hard to make this as interactive as possible and give as many opportunities to connect with the presenters as possible. And we really hope that you're going to make use of those. If for some reason you're not able to watch a presentation at the prescribed time, we will be recording and posting the videos of the sessions to the presentation website. And these are going to be available under the Recorded Sessions tab. You can expect these to be available the day after the presentations are given. And yesterday, Steve Kite, the conference organizer, made a great welcome presentation to the VSSW. He also talked about the status of the in-person ISSW plan for Fernie 2021. So if you missed that talk yesterday, you can check out that video on the Recorded Sessions tab during a break. I've mentioned we're hosting this event from Fernie, but we're curious about where you are from. So I'm gonna ask for the poll to go onto the screen, and you should see that right now. So if you can just reach forward from your couch or from your desk or wherever you're watching from and answer the question, where are you watching from? That would be fantastic. We'll give a few seconds to answer the question. I should note that with these polls, we're limited to having 5 options. So if you are from maybe Antarctica, which was mentioned yesterday as a potential place where we could potentially see a viewer or two, then rather than throw your hands up in despair, please tell us where you're from using the chat window. And we're going to be coming back to that chat window. In some people's browsers, it's called the questions box. Sometimes it's labeled questions, ask questions to the organizers. It's not the greatest name, but we're using that as a chat window, so then you can drop in your location there if you need to. So it appears as though we're North America centric, and Europe, around about over a third of people watching from Europe. We don't have any from South America, and only 1% of attendees are from Asia, and I think it's around about 3 in the morning in New Zealand, and maybe even earlier than that, around midnight in Australia. So I guess those folks are still in bed. Very sensible. So sponsors are a very important part of the VSSW. And on the screen, you should see a list of our sponsors for this event. And CIL are a title sponsor. They make avalanche-specific explosive products as well as high-tech remote avalanche control systems. MND is the new name for TAS. They're a world-class Avalanche expert and offer the tagline, which is one partner, many solutions. Tech is a diversified natural resource company and has a significant community presence in the Elk Valley. Avalanche Canada is the home of public avalanche forecasting in Canada, and their tagline is get the gear, get the training, get the forecast. Our other important sponsors include VSSW, the City of Fernie, and Elkview Lodge, which is where we're broadcasting this event from. In addition to our main sponsors, we have short videos that in addition to our main sponsors, we also have ongoing support for other sponsors associated with the ISSW. And these companies and organizations have already stepped up to the plate to support the ISSW, and we're hoping that they will continue to do so as we plan and prepare for the in-person ISSW event in Fernie for 2021. So we will be showing some videos about these sponsors, and each of the main sponsors has a short video associated with that. And we'll be showing those at the start of each session. And I hope you enjoy those videos. They're really very excellent, well-made videos. So without the contribution from the presenters, we would not have a virtual snow science workshop. So I'm incredibly thankful to the 18 speakers, the 10 panelists, and numerous authors associated with 46 poster presentations. That is a vast amount of work, and your contributions to this event are absolutely instrumental to the success of the VSSW. So thank you very much indeed. So now I'd like to introduce our very talented Brent Strand, who's the technical producer for this conference. Brent's been absolutely relentless in cracking the whip, getting practice sessions organized, firefighting a range of issues with the technology, and now he's pressing all the buttons and turning all the knobs to make this live show happen. Brent's going to talk to you about the flow of the day and give you some important details about GoToWebinar and how to make the most out of it for you. Brent, over to you.
Thank you, James. Welcome everybody to the VSSW. I'm glad you can attend this morning, afternoon, evening. We're going to talk about how the sessions are going to flow in the next couple days. Basically, they're going to be broken up into 3 different sessions throughout the day. Each session is going to start with the oral presentations starting in the morning group. Then there will be a half-hour break. We're going to move to our panel discussions, which will continue into around noon our time, Mountain Daylight Time. And then we'll have another half-hour break and go into the oral session in the afternoon. At the end of today's sessions, we're going to start our poster sessions off near the end of the day around 2 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. As we go through these sessions, at the end of each session, we're going to close that webinar. We'll have a half-hour break for us to do some little tidying up in the background here. And then you will have to go back to the website, click on that Go to Live link to bring you back to the next session. That would happen at the end of each session for the next 2 sessions. And then your 3rd session, you'll go back in there and hit that Go to Live link, and it'll bring you right back into the meetings again. Now, as far as your controls, you all come in self-muted, so we don't have a couple hundred people talking over each other. Once that you come in, you will be muted. We are looking for folks, if you do have some questions and comments and stuff, to happen at the end of the presentations. There's a raise hand function. There's a little button on the bottom of your control panel, and you can see that. You'll just hit that raise hand button. It'll put you in a list, and then we will queue you at the end of the presentations for any questions you may have for the speakers. When you get queued, you will be listed by name. I will say your name. You will be unmuted. You can please start with your name and where you're from, and proceed with your question and have your discussion with the speaker. Once you're done, I will remute you folks, and then you can go back to being an attendee. With that being said, I think we're going to start things up here, and I'm going to hand it over back to James.
Thanks a lot, Brent. So I'm just going to reiterate just a couple of points here before we get the main show going. We're going to try hard to start at the top and bottom of the hour for each session, and that just makes it a little easier for people who are planning to join in specific events, specific talks. And that might give us a few little challenges with getting the timing exactly right. So there's a possibility you might see some extra sponsorship videos, or maybe a slide just telling you just to be patient a little bit. In between the talks themselves, you don't need to close down the GoToWebinar platform. That's only between the sessions. So if you do see that little welcome screen, just leave it on, go take a little break, time to make a coffee or have a stronger drink, whatever it's right for your time where you're listening from. Reiterate about the comment box. We really are trying to encourage people to use that chat function. Like I said, the name of that box on some platforms is a little confusing. So if it says questions, feel free to drop your comments in there. If you do have a question, sure, drop it in there too. And we may not answer it here. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Maybe another participant will know the answer as well and be able to chime in. So, you know, we are hopeful that that's going to give an extra dimension and allow additional comments to be made and given a little extra flavor to that. And then question answer sessions, we are asking for those to be done orally. And as Brent went through, it's the raise hand function that needs to be, you need to put that up in order to be able to get in the queue to ask a question during the question and answer sessions. And again, this is a really prime opportunity to drill down into some of the speakers' talks and ask for a little bit more context and query them about their exact methods and other things that you may want to know. So we're, once again, I'm gonna focus on the outside view here. This is our view from the Elkview Lodge. It's a stunning, stunning place. We've got 3 separate speaker podiums set up. We've got a very big room. There's a lot of distance between us all. Obviously, it's a little challenging to keep things running in our times where we need to be wearing masks and need to be physically distant from everybody else. But it's been an absolute privilege to set everything up here and work towards bringing this show live to you. And it's coming right around to the top of the hour here, right around to 8 o'clock. So we're going to get the show properly started here. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Robin Siggers, who's going to moderate the first session for us, which is entitled Decision Making and Terrain. And Robin is the Outdoor Operations Manager with Fernie Alpine Resort. And Robin started ski patrolling way back in the 1970s. Robin is a very familiar face to all of those in the snow industry in Fernie, and he knows things. Thanks, and Robin, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I wish you could see how absolutely gorgeous it is here today in Fernie, BC. I just wish you could all be here with us. My session today is Decision Making and Terrain. This session is sponsored by CIL Avalanche Guard, provider of avalanche-specific explosive products and high-tech remote avalanche control systems. As James said, people know me for miles around, or at least a mile, or, you know, quarter mile. Like some people know me. It's because I know things. And when I say that it's going to snow 70 centimeters overnight in the next 24 hours. They believe it because it happens. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the weather forecast, but because this is a virtual conference, I thought I would have to expand the scope. So the Earth, this is expected to rotate around the sun for the next 20 or 365 days. Presumably, it will rotate on its wobbly little axis every 24 hours. And for most of us, the sun will continue to rise. Always a good thing. For you in the south, you'll see the beginning of spring. Summer's on the way. We're all happy for you. Enjoy it while it lasts. However, in the north, we are looking forward to darker, colder conditions. If you live in the Arctic, the sun is about to disappear completely. Sorry about that. We looked into it. Can't be helped. For the rest of us, though, this will bring the absolute joy of winter in the mountains. The bliss of deep powder skiing and avalanches. Lots of avalanches. Large and small avalanches. Avalanches for us to observe, avoid, bomb, blast, and forecast. To dissect, to postulate, analyze, and evaluate. Avalanches for us to avoid and keep us all employed. But for most of us, the weather, at least, will be normal. And that is something to be thankful for. Personally, I'm thankful to moderate this session on decision-making and terrain. This session combines human thought processes with moving about in the terrain. And we have an incredible lineup of speakers this morning. But to begin, a word from our title sponsor, CIL Explosives. Here's a short video on the Avalanche Guard. This is a Swiss product built by Inon Shetty, distributed in North America with installations in the Rogers Pass, Stevens Pass, Teton Pass, Loveland Pass, as well as the Alaska Railway. For information on CIL products, visit the website, cilexplosives.com. And we're back. Okay. All right, decision-making and terrain. These topics that discuss the human sciences. In my view, these are as equally important as snow sciences. So many incidents in my career have happened when the party was well aware of the snowpack conditions and made a poor terrain decision. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Andrea Mansberg. Andrea comes to us today from Tromsø in Norway. Andrea is a professor at the Arctic University in Norway. She's also the founder, creator, and lead researcher of the White Heat Project, which began in 2017 and apparently has taken on a life of its own as a resource for avalanche education products. Check it out, whiteheatproject.com. She's also involved in the CARE research group, Center for Avalanche Research and Education, great acronym. And Andrea will speak to us today about how behavioral economics can shed light on some of the subpar, distorted human decisions that we make. I like how people vote, I guess. I know. No, she's not talking about that. She's talking about people in avalanche terrain and their behavioral economics, and why we do not always behave as Homo economicus. Andrea, take it away. Sorry, Andrea, we're having a slight audio difficulty. Your mic is not coming through.
Is it working now?
Yes, it is.
Is it working now? Okay, I'm so sorry. My speakers are having a life of its own as well. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm very glad to give this presentation. I pre-recorded my video and it's pretty self-explanatory, so I hope you all enjoy it. Hi, my name is Andrea Mansberg and I'm a professor in economics. Today I would like to talk about how a behavioral economist looks at decision-making in avalanche terrain and why I think that the avalanche community might find this interesting. So many people think that economists do research on GDP and inflation. But the truth is that economic research does not have to be about money at all. The core of economics as a science is decision-making, regardless if the decision maker is a banker or a backcountry rider. The reason for why economists care so much about decisions is that the aim of the science is to increase the well-being or happiness in society. And in order to do so, we need to understand how people make decisions, why they make certain decisions, and when those decisions create problems, either for the individual or for society. And finally, what we can do to solve those problems or at least reduce them. So when we go into the backcountry, we need to make a range of decisions. For example, where to go and who to bring. Now, when we make these decisions, we consciously or unconsciously evaluate the pros and cons of our different options. For example, the view, the terrain, the feel of the snow, and the risk of having an accident. Now, when we choose to do something, we do so because we think that that is our best option. It doesn't necessarily have to be our ideal choice because we face constraints. For example, our technical skills, the weather, time, where we live, or for example, our partners. But when we do something, we do so because given those circumstances, we think that doing this will make us as happy as possible. So suppose that I know the consequences of an avalanche accident, and I know that conditions are a bit shaky, and I still find that the pros of riding a bull line outweigh the cons. An economist does not necessarily see this as a problem, because Different people have different preferences. And as long as my decision makes me happy in the long run and doesn't hurt anyone else, economists are happy. Economists become unhappy and very interested when people make decisions that reduce their happiness in the long run or that hurt others. So there are two reasons for why we sometimes make decisions that make us unhappy. The first one is that we change our preferences and therefore regret our decisions. And the second is that we don't always use valuable information that could help us make better decisions. So let's start with regret. Every autumn, I make a plan that this year I'm going to exercise regularly so that I can do all the backcountry adventures that I want to do during the ski season. My problem is that when I get back from work each night, the sofa, Netflix, and a beer seems a whole lot more tempting than doing intervals in the rain. This is especially the case if I'm hungry and tired. To make things worse, I keep thinking that today I'm going to stay in the sofa, but tomorrow I'm going to go out. But when tomorrow comes, the sofa just looks so darn good. And I keep doing this, and then when the ski season comes, I still have my spaghetti thighs, and I end up feeling very unhappy with myself. So the reason why I end up in this situation is that I, just like many others, feel that what I experience right now, both pleasures and pain, are much more important than what I might experience in the future. This is especially the case when I experience strong emotions, like when I'm scared or tired or hungry or perhaps horny. All I can focus on is satisfying those needs right now. I can't think about my future. Economists call this present bias preferences because we overvalue the present over the future. Now, present bias isn't something that is necessarily bad because it makes us focus on satisfying our needs right now, like getting laid, getting fed, getting away from danger. But they can create problems if we are unaware that we have them or if we can't control ourselves in some situations. So in the backcountry, we run into trouble if we procrastinate to exercise to get fit or practice with our beacons or other rescue. And if we make decisions when we're horny for powder or scared or hangry, we might end up focusing on satisfying those needs instead of what we really should focus on. So another reason that we sometimes do things that we later regret is that humans hate to lose. In fact, we hate it so much that even people who in general really dislike taking risks to win something are often willing to take large chances to avoid losses. The problem is that some situations can make us change our minds about what we see as a loss. So before we start a project, for example, a backcountry trip, we usually see the completion of that project, skiing a nice line in nice snow, as a potential gain. And we're therefore often fairly risk averse. However, when we put effort, time, and perhaps even money into the project, climbing the mountain, we often change our mind and now see not skiing the line as a loss. And this can make us willing to take chances. Economists call these the sunk cost fallacy. It's a fallacy because we focus on irrelevant information. In this case, having climbed a mountain. Now, the sunk cost fallacy is not a huge problem if our project is good and if we have a high chance of succeeding. But it can be catastrophic if we have realized along the way that the risk of failing is much higher. So in our backcountry example, if we realize as we're climbing the mountain that snow conditions are a whole lot more shaky than we initially thought, now if we see skiing the line as a potential gain, we would probably turn back. But if we see it as a loss, we might push on and end up in big trouble. All right, so the sunk cost fallacy makes us focus on things that we really should ignore. let's now talk about why we sometimes ignore information that we really should pay attention to. So there are at least two reasons for this. The first one is that humans really like to feel good about themselves. We feel good when we feel smart and skilled. And we feel smart and skilled when we are the creators of our own successes and when we can blame our failures on things that are outside of our control. And feel even better when we outperform others. The second reason is that avalanche terrain seldom gives us correct feedback on the quality of our decisions. This gives us ample opportunities to interpret information in a flattering but false way. So when I go out into the backcountry and I ski a steep line and things go well, I am motivated to think that I made a good decision, even though I might have just gotten lucky. And on the rare occasions when things go bad and I have a close call or an accident, I'm very likely to start by focusing on all the things that I could not control that led up to the accident. By contrast, when I see that other people ride steep terrain, I'm much more likely to think that they just got lucky, that nothing bad happened. And when I read avalanche accidents reports, I'm very good at finding all the mistakes that they did. So what this means is that we, in avalanche terrain, we're unlikely to learn from our own experiences. And we may not learn very much from reading avalanche accidents reports. And it also means that avalanche terrain is a very fertile soil to grow overconfidence in our ability to mitigate avalanche risk. All right, so finally, why do we sometimes do things that hurt others? Well, one reason for this comes from evolution. Humans are very social animals. We're much stronger in a social group than we are alone. And our social status within a group affects our access to resources and our chances to get laid. As a consequence, our self-esteem is closely connected to how well we do in comparison to others. In fact, one of the reasons that Facebook and Instagram are so successful is that it allows us to signal our social status and compare to others. Now, how much people care about social status differs from person to person. And what we think is signals social status also varies. Some people may think that having a nice car is super important and having a nicer car than your neighbor is even more important, while others don't care about cars at all. But they do care about having more powder days or skiing more steep terrain than their peers. The problem here is that if I outperform my friends on something that is socially valued, I make them feel less happy with themselves, and I motivate them to try harder. What this means is that I may make them do things that they ideally do not want to do just to feel good enough. Our research showed that many backcountry riders associate riding bold terrain with social status, and that they feel that if their friends ride bolder terrain than they do, they feel less happy. And finally, that this makes them more willing to ride potentially dangerous terrain. Okay, so I've talked a lot about problems, and you might rightfully ask yourself, what's the use? Well, I would like to argue that in order to find solutions and improve decision-making in avalanche terrain, we need to know what the problems are. Because different problems require different interventions. And different people have different problems, so we need to know who has which problem. So for example, if we think or find that some people have a problem because they changed their preferences, we have to make them aware of this and help them build structures that keep them to commit to their plans. This could, for example, mean that we could set up committing beacon practice sessions during the autumn. And if we think that people misinterpret information, we might have to consider how we write the avalanche accident reports. And we might have to train people to ask themselves, how could this have been me when they read those reports? And finally, we could train people to, before they drop into a line, think about how would the report read? because this would put them in the other's perspective. Finally, if backcountry riders are driven by social status, we could try to affect the social norms by targeting role models, because social norms are dynamic, they change over time. It's perfectly possible to make safety and knowledge cool again. There is actually one example, the backcountry ascender, that has tried to do this. Super cool project. All right, to wrap up, behavioral economists studies how people make decisions and when those decisions create problems and what we can do to solve them. My research groups has so far only made a few studies. And in the future, we want to analyze a wider range of hypotheses and, more importantly, study which interventions that are effective so that we can improve decision-making in avalanche terrain. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, your work is really appreciated on many levels. Thank you so much for being part of the virtual snow science workshop from all of us here on the committee. We have time now for some questions. Do we have some questions? Anybody question people? Question coming?
Yes, we have one question from the floor from Krista Hildebrandt, please.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to know the source of your studies. That was an amazing presentation, but how did you gather some of that information?
Well, so many of the things that I talked about are common knowledge by behavioral economists and psychologists for that matter. We steal a lot from the psychologists. We've done a few studies. We've studied the desire to gain social status among backcountry riders and social factors. We've also started to study the role of strong emotions, but those studies are still very preliminary. And we have done a study on how we perceive the control that we have on snow stability and what others have. So those are our own studies, and the rest are more just the literature and behavioral economics applied to an avalanche context. Was that an answer to your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We have another question from the floor for Curtis Pollock, please.
Hey, good morning. Thank you. Right at the very beginning of your talk, you discussed something very simple, but two kind of major decisions before heading into the backcountry, and that was where to go and who to bring. I think the second point of that is often underutilized. I think people end up just, who can I bring? Who's actually available to come? Is there any more study decision-making tools, any more literature on the idea of that decision-making, i.e. who to bring, how that affects our day, that type of procedure and mindset?
Not that I know of, not that I've seen. There might be some other panelists in the session that know more. But what I do know, I think you're raising a very important question, because people have very different risk preferences. That's something that we've seen in our studies, that some people are just really willing to take risk, while others are not. So my take is always bring someone who has the same risk tolerance as you do, because then nobody gets disappointed and nobody exposes anyone else to danger unintendedly. So I think that's so important, to go with people that you communicate well with and where you sort of have the same goals.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree. I think that's pretty well understood in the professional realm, maybe not in the recreational side, and some sort of tools to purvey that or to relay that information, I think would be quite important. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have A question from the floor from Stuart Rude, please.
Andrea, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. I might say I really enjoyed a spring sequence at Tromsø, enjoying the skiing there. You're very lucky. So there's a saying that I've kind of liked, and that is that good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. But your suggestion that we're unlikely to learn from our own experience suggests that that saying is not valid. What do you think?
Good question. No, I think that's true. I mean, we certainly do learn some from our experiences, but I think that we might have to train ourselves to learn more. Not everybody learns from their experiences. It all depends on how we analyze it. If we try to protect our self-esteem and our self-image, or if we really try to learn. And I think that's super important for avalanche training and avalanche education to really train themselves to how do we learn in avalanche terrain? How can we learn from the limited feedback that we do get, both from others' experiences and from our own. But I do think that we learn, but we might have to train ourselves to actually learn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have another question from the floor from Stephen Jones, please. Stephen Jones, you'll have to unmute yourself, please. Go ahead, Stephen. Sorry, Stephen, we're not hearing you here today, so we're going to move on to the next question. We have a question from Sean Zimmerman-Wall, please.
Yeah, good morning, Andrea, or whatever time it might be where you are. My name is Sean. I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. My question is, in your research, have you examined the idea of tight and loose cultures? Meaning, what role does culture play? You can think of it traditionally as what country you're from and the norms that you experienced growing up and how that impacts your decision making, versus what community culture are you part of, thinking in terms of like what ski town are you from or what professional environment are you from?
Yeah, I think that is super interesting, and that really boils down to social norms, and those varies both over time and over place. We have not studied that specifically, but I've heard others raising that question before, and I think it's a very interesting topic to study. What we have seen is that we've done studies in Norway and the US, and it looks like there are definitely differences between different countries. So I think that would be very interesting to study, and also to see how people change over time. I know now that there is ongoing work. We're collecting panel data, so we're following people over time in Norway, and that is starting to being built up, I think, in Canada by Hagley and his group, and also in North America. So that will really sort of allow research to dig into that and look into it. But I think it's a very interesting question, but unfortunately, I don't know too much about it yet.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, well, that pretty much brings us to the end of our time limit there, but I'm sure there's lots of other questions, Andrea. And I really enjoyed your talk. I'm going to go back and look it over some more and see if I can figure out with your research how to get me off the couch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on. Our next presenter, Laura Mcguire. Laura, is she there? She is? Okay, great. Laura comes to us today from Leavenworth, Washington, in the North Cascades. nestled here in the Pacific Northwest. Laura holds a master's degree in human factors and safety systems. She has 15 years experience working in industry in the aviation, forestry, and energy sectors. And Laura, with her PhD in cognitive systems, is well prepared to discuss how we use cognitive energy in our high-paced decision-making environments, and how those cognitive costs can escalate and cause us communication challenges. Incidentally, I have had the pleasure to work with Laura in the past, not at the university, mind you, but back here in 1998, Laura Mcguire had an illustrious career as a liftie here at Fernie Alpine Resort. And she is one of the many staff that we have prepared and sent forth into the world to receive their doctorate. Laura's topic, controlling cognitive costs of coordination. She will delve into the topic of why communication becomes hard when we run out of cognitive capital. Take it away, Laura.
All right, thank you very much, Robin, and thanks so much for having me here today. Kudos to the organizing committee for just tucking and rolling with the events of this year. So I've only got 15 minutes to distill about 3 years of research, so I'm going to jump straight into it today. And the research that I'm sharing is looking at a very specific aspect of cognitive work. And when I'm talking about cognitive work, it's the thinking parts of your job. And the specific aspect of the cognitive work has to do with coordination across multiple roles and multiple points in time. And so the bottom line for my talk here today is to give you some new insights into practice with the intent of increasing the ability to increasing the capacity and the strategies that you have as part of a group or a team that's managing risk in avalanche terrain. So my intent here is to get you thinking when someone says it's a communication problem or we need to communicate more, to be thinking we need to coordinate more, or it may be a coordination problem. And so if that sounds a bit heady for a Monday morning, don't worry. I'm going to start us off with a really concrete example to get us all on the same page. And then in these 5 minutes up front, I'm going to lay out the central thesis of my talk, which is that we can level up the performance by thinking about the effort that's involved in this coordination more broadly, not just in communication. And then I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to talk about what happens with poor communication and how it actually incurs these additional costs, as Robin said, and it sucks up our valuable time and attention. And then lastly, I'm going to end with some strategies that you can use to control these costs of coordination across these multiple scales. So let's take a fictitious but probably a highly likely scenario for a control team that's responsible for managing risks to a transportation corridor, to a highway. And up here on Wind Drift Pass, the program manager is super diligent. And so a storm cycle that's coming in is going to wreak havoc upon the holiday travel. So coordination kicks into high gear. Right away, she calls her team. And she shares the plan. She finds out who's able to come in early, who can deal with this increased workload. She wants to make sure everyone's up to speed because it's likely that they're going to be triggering something big. So then she's calling in the big guns, and literally because the armed forces are going to need to be brought in to use the howitzer for this much snow. Then she's going to call local law enforcement to close those roads. And she's got the plow trucks on standby because the last time this drainage released, it ran all the way across the road. And of course, that means that it's important that the local radio station is broadcasting the closures to control, or the closures for the control work to avoid having vehicles piled up and waiting. And of course, the roadway signs need to change so that they can limit the amount of angry drivers that are sitting on the side of the road and unsure about what's going on. And lastly, they'll need to get the word out on social media so there isn't anyone out skiing lines on dawn patrol when they start blasting. So once this plan is in place, that's already a lot of coordination. And then there's ongoing continual adjustments and adaptations as the world throws surprises at us. And each time our manager here takes on additional effort to keep everyone appraised and to keep everyone adjusted relative to their own goals and priorities. So communication here is undoubtedly important, or in any other kind of similar situations where you have multiple roles that are related, but they all have separate goals and they have to work together to achieve a shared outcome. So today I want to broaden this lens from the communication of all of these roles to look at this underlying functional capability, and that's joint activity. And so you might be saying, yeah, we know this. This is why we have the procedures. And yeah, the procedures and the rules give us a shared frame of reference. But if we go throw back to 2018 ISSW, myself and my colleague, Jesse Percival, showed that of those 3 core findings, the most important one was that a lot of the cognitive work, a lot of the effort that goes into actually doing this work effectively is hidden. It's not in those formal protocols. And so today's work is going to go a little bit deeper on this finding by revealing that this additional cognitive effort is an additional burden, and it has to be accounted for in our work practices, it has to be trained for, and it has to be designed for in how we work together as a team. So the main thesis here is that accounting for both the cognitive and the coordinative demands of avalanche risk management work can improve this adaptability and the group performance. And this is particularly true as the pace and the complexity of work increases. So in the example that I gave you before, the tempo of work is quite low, there's lots of moving parts, but you might be able to anticipate and adjust in real time. In higher consequence events or higher pace events, your ability to adjust decreases, and you can get overwhelmed by these additional costs in the coordination. So you might say, well, is it actually worth coordinating then? And of course, it's pretty clear in avalanche management that you can't do that alone. And in fact, nearly all forms of meaningful or challenging work is joint activity. So not only is coordination important, it's unavoidably important. And work across the board is becoming increasingly interdependent. It's becoming more and more tightly coupled because the advantages afforded by technology. And so some of these technologies can change the nature of these coordinated parties as well. So you might be thinking, well, hey, I actually just installed a GAZEX system, so we've effectively reduced the number of technicians. Have we decreased our coordination requirements? Not really. You've actually just transformed the nature of those coordination demands. Because instead of having boots on the ground, you've now extended that network to include all the technicians who service and maintain the systems, the software engineers who manage your interface with the system, and the parts manufacturers who you'll need when the parts break or when they wear out. So your coordination timescales expand, your parties change, and the nature of those relationships and dynamics change. So I'll be clear here to say that I'm not saying technology is a bad thing, but the point is that coordination across multiple parties is a given, whether it's someone on skis or whether it's someone on the other end of a support line. So if you're wondering why we're using the term joint activity and not teamwork, that is an excellent question, and I'm hoping that you ask it in the question and answer period. But we're going to move on because the second fundamental principle about coordination is that it incurs a cognitive cost for everybody involved. So these costs, they're not financial, they're cognitive. You spend precious resources attending to either organizing the coordinative activity, you're delegating it, you are maybe someone who is being directable, you're taking direction from someone else, you're communicating about shared plans, you're reprioritizing the goals, maybe you're taking initiative and you're trying to take on or take away some of the coordinative benefit or burden from someone else. or you're investing in others. So you've recruited new resources to help lower some of the costs of coordination. But in order for them to be useful, you need to bring them up to speed to what's happening, what's the plan, and put them in place. All of that actually takes effort. And at a point in time where you may be least likely to be able to afford that effort. So this is a long walk to get to this argument that we should be emphasizing coordination over communication. And no one can disagree with the statement that good communication is important. In fact, it is critical to coordination. But when we unpack this further, we find it a little bit insufficient, because knowing what to say, who to say it to, and at what point in time is all cognitive and coordinative work that's required for really smooth and successful coordination. So let's ground this a little bit, because it is a pretty core concept. If you think about the last time that you came into a non-routine event in your work, it might be an unexpected part of the job, but something that represents an anomaly. It's kind of an outlier. It might have been a first aid emergency. It might have been a client that got caught and carried. Whatever it is, you come into the event while it's underway. And in order to have good communication in this context, there's a whole lot of background work that you need to do, additional cognitive work that has to happen very rapidly. Things like, okay, what does everyone else know about this situation? How current is that knowledge? How much do I have to share, or do I need to be shared? And how much is too much? How much do other people know about what's going on? How good are they at what we are about to do? And what do they know about how good I am about what we're about to do? And then when we start thinking about who is involved, in what ways are they involved? Who could be involved? You need people who aren't at the site right there. How do you get them involved? And what will they stop doing? What will they defer their work in order to come and help me? And lastly, at what point in time can we interrupt them right now? If not now, when can I get them? How do I adjust the things that I'm doing so I can slow down or speed up so we have good, smooth coordination across this shared activity that we're trying to do? So there's a lot that's going on in this slide, and it's the kind of slide that they tell you never to put into a presentation because it's busy and it's chaotic and it's kind of hard to understand. But I've also done that intentionally because it's representative of these coordinative demands that show up in day-to-day operations in the heat of the moment. And the more people that get involved, the faster the tempo, and the more geographically dispersed the parties are, and the higher the consequences of the outcomes, the more these demands can overwhelm the capabilities of a group for collective performance. We start to see things like coordination breakdowns, where the efforts required to sustain joint activity become very high. And you start hearing people talk explicitly about coordination. Wait, we need to stop, we need to regroup. You might start to see individuals break off instead of doing collective work. And this is where you see groups fail to accomplish their shared goals, or at its worst, where they can't sustain collective activity that keeps people safe. So there's a number of different concepts that I could talk about here, but I'm going to grab one because it's useful for us to think about, is common ground. And this is how we shared knowledge, beliefs, assumptions about how work is being done, the organization that you're working in, and who you're working with. And we establish these when you take on a new job, a new organization, you move to a new area. You maintain it because the world changes, and so you have to continually adjust your knowledge and beliefs and assumptions. And lastly, it needs repairing, because when the pace of the world, the change in the world, exceeds the pace at which we can collaboratively update, we get left behind. So repairing looks like someone noticing that something's not right and asking questions. So common ground is both a joint activity. It's common to your organization, your role. Are you a guide? Are you a forecaster? Are you a technician? Your experience, are you the expert? Do you have local knowledge or expertise? it's relative to your organization. What kinds of goals and priorities does your organization expect out of your performance? And it's relative to the other parties in the group as well. What kinds of predispositions or orientations do they have to the work that you're about to do? And how do you interact with that? So we continually build and maintain this in our day-to-day interactions with coworkers that we work with continuously. But we also have to establish common ground about an incident. So if you're coming into a new event, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of ambiguity, and there may be new people or new parties that we don't know what they know, we don't know their level of experience or their orientation towards the problem. So when we coordinate with people that we share substantial common ground, we can handle a lot of variability in the types of incidents we respond to, because we're better able to recognize when we're deviating from our shared basis of knowledge or our beliefs or assumptions, and we may get in over our heads. So this is a super high blow-by of a pretty complex topic. But if I've done my job right, we should be on the same page that we'll get more mileage out of strategies for improving risk management through the broader lens of coordination. So I wanted to come back to something that I said earlier, and this is about the pace and complexity of work. Is the greater the trouble that you're facing, the higher the tempo that's demanded, the greater the information processing requirements are to cope with that trouble or activities. So these high tempo situations, if you haven't designed for coordination appropriately, you start paying the costs and the penalties of poorly supported work. So we covered a whole lot of terrain, and I promised these last couple minutes to be practical strategies, and I know I'm running long here. So I am a cognitive systems engineer. I think across the whole influence of the system of work, not just the Avalanche professional, but the regulators who define some of the guardrails around their work, the industry associations that set the competency frameworks, the educators who define the education that they receive, and the management that in the organizations that they work in. So I'm going to start at the top, the industry association. Some of the strategies that we can use to better control coordination costs is to look at curriculum that can introduce coordination competencies. How do we help each other be better at coordinating and collaborating across a group? That's not just about communication. Can we encourage the adoption and practices of technologies that aid distributed information sharing and rapid exchanges of information? And how do we get industry-specific coordination devices? How do we elicit and interest tool manufacturers to be curious about the space that we work in? Operations managers, cataloging all of the coordination points in your operation is really time consuming, and it may not generate really reasonable return on investments. But it's worth asking your teams for examples of when they experienced coordination breakdowns, and to look at if you can shift the costs of coordination to other points in time or other roles. You can design for cross-functional interactions. If you are working across multiple roles that don't have good shared common ground, help them learn a little bit more about the goals and priorities of that role. And you can provide sufficient opportunities for realistic simulation training that includes both escalating coordinative and cognitive demands at the same time. And finally, for the individual practitioners and teams, these micro learning opportunities, when you see common ground breaking down, when you recognize that a colleague is making an incorrect assumption or you think it's an incorrect assumption, call it out. Use that as an opportunity to share knowledge, to bridge gaps in understanding, and to level up your team as a whole. Practicing coordination. Make yourself observable, prepare yourself for taking direction, learn a bit more about what others need from you in order to help coordinate more effectively with you, and get other roles involved in your decision making. So let me close by saying this. cognitive costs of controlling the cognitive costs of coordination in avalanche terrain is not an easy problem, but it's an important one. And if we move past, if we move past the idea of communication, we open up a wider range of possibilities to be able to improve risk management. Thank you.
Wow, incredible. I can definitely relate to a number of those, what you're talking about, in a number of different scenarios, like an avalanche accident, or a lift goes down for an extended period of time, or opening a ski area during a pandemic. So thank you so much, Laura. That was a great discussion, very enlightening, and thank you so much from all of us in the ISSW committee here for presenting and being a part of this event. Now, we do have some time for some questions.
We have a question from the floor from Clancy Nelson, please. Go ahead, Clancy Nelson. Clancy, it
Having
looks like,
coordination problems.
yeah, Clancy, it looks like your mic is on, but we're not getting any sound out of you. Give you one more try, please. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. We have a question from Brad Acker, please.
Hello, yeah, thanks for the talk. This is Brad Acker. I'm down in the Pacific Northwest, US, so go OSU. When I think of coordination in our environment, I often think of the incident command system. Could you make some comments maybe about how the, is the incident command system a good example of this type of coordination leading to good communication?
Yeah, so the incident command system is an interesting one because I'd argue that it is an oversimplification. So in that model, for those of you who aren't familiar to it, in a very high level, the incident command is basically a structure that kind of creates a hierarchy of decision making and distributes kind of different roles and functions to different folks. But what happens in that kind of scenario is that having sort of a single, or in very large scale events, point of contact, that person can become a workload bottleneck because the pace of the event exceeds their ability to keep track of everything that's going on to the level that's needed to be making appropriate decisions and actions. So what we start to see is localized action taking place, people taking initiative, and this is often frowned upon in the ICS system because it is because the command and control sort of like hierarchy is expected there. So I think there is a balance. We don't want freeform anarchy where everybody just does everything, because that's uncoordinated activity, but we want localized initiative to be able to be taken so that those who are closest to a point in a point of the event, say if it's a rescue scenario, you can have smaller groups that break off and take initiative and handle smaller tasks and report that back. There is a number of other functions that are unsupported in the ICS system, in the sense of less, you take less advantage of the full capabilities of the team to be able to help coordinate. So by providing information, by proactively looking at certain things, by anticipating the needs of the incident commander, and preemptively kind of preparing for the next steps. So it can kind of slow down the activity in some ways. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
It's a bit of a controversial statement because it is very well accepted in a number of industries, but even the incident command, you know, the disaster recovery community has actually started to question some aspects of that for their purposes as well.
We currently have one more question from the floor from Zach Kiskinen.
Hi, Zach.
Sorry, it looks like Zach just dropped out. He chose not to ask a question. We have no more questions from the floor, Laura.
Okay, well, thanks for having me here.
Stand by. I think we have a email question. Yeah, we have a question from the message.
Laura, this question is for you. It is from Clancy, who had technical issues before. He just posted his question on the chat box. When you talk about coordination as a cost that taxes our cognitive abilities, I picture an economic supply-demand chart. That kind of implies that coordination and cognitive abilities should be optimized, where a certain amount of coordination meets with the same amount of cognitive ability. Does that sound right?
It's an interesting concept. I think one of the things about coordination and cognitive demand is that people are very adept at deploying different strategies to control those costs. So they will shed load, they'll drop some tasks, they'll defer it to a different point in time, they'll pass it off to someone else. So in some ways, what they're doing is they're creating additional capacity for themselves, or they're using the capacity of others to be able to increase their own ability to maintain high levels of coordination and cognitive demands. So I think it's not necessarily a finite resource, if that's kind of where you're going with that question, but instead we can adapt and be quite resilient and in our capacity to be able to coordinate and deal with the technical aspects of the work that we're doing.
All right, Laura, we do have another question from the floor from Thomas Poitras, please. Go ahead, Thomas. Yeah, looks like you're muting and unmuting your mic a couple times there. Looks like you're good to talk right now. If you give it a go there, Thomas. Thomas, if you could possibly send that into the chat box there, we could get Laura to answer that after the fact. And yeah, we have no more questions from the floor.
Okay, that pretty much concludes our time. Laura, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Very interesting work, and you can see it have great value to me personally to sort some of these things out and become less cognitively overloaded at certain times. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. All right. We are now moving to Jordy Hendricks. Jordy, are you there? My goodness, I just wish you could see how beautiful it is out the window here in Fernie, BC. I just wish so much that everybody was here with us today. But this is absolutely the next best thing. We have Jordy Hendricks with us now. He's coming to us from Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. Montana State and Bozeman have a long history of avalanche research and alumni that include many respected researchers and practitioners in snow sciences. I've had the pleasure to work with some of them down there in the out of bounds areas of Bridger Bowl, exclusively for research back in the day. We didn't do any skiing though, we just did research. Jordy is the director of the Snow Avalanche Science Laboratory in the university's Earth Sciences Department. A very prestigious and full project, I would assume. Jordy is a researcher as well with the White Heat project that was mentioned earlier. He has spent 20 years working on avalanche projects from the Antarctic to the Arctic and everywhere in between. Jordy's talk today, he will illustrate and provide insight on decision-making in avalanche terrain. Jordy is working with 10 years of data that track users traveling through avalanche terrain in the backcountry. And his team's mission is to extract and distill terrain use and risk information from these users. Jordy, thank you for being with us today. Take it away.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to present at the VSSW, and a huge thank you to the organizers for putting on this event. Obviously, with COVID coming in, it's changed the plans, but I think it's been amazing how the organizers have moved with the times and made this possible. It didn't seem like it would be appropriate to not have an ISSW this year, so thank you for letting me be here. So my talk today is looking at how we've used some different techniques to understand how people use terrain. And I want to recognize my co-authors here. This work has been done with a number of other people, including Jerry Johnson, Andrea Mansberg, who you've heard from this morning already, John Sykes, Diana Sally, Albert Larson, and Andrew Shower as well. And this work kind of summarizes a number of different projects where we've tried to get at how people use terrain and what that tells us around their decision making and also around their terrain preferences, and how we can use that as a lens to better understand when certain groups or certain people or certain settings might make people make risky decisions than they intend to. So it's trying to tie into some of these ideas that Andrea just spoke about and Laura spoke about as well, but using observed terrain as a lens on that idea. So when we teach avalanche classes, we often talk about how when the snowpack is your problem, terrain is your solution. And the basic idea there is that even under really challenging snowpack conditions, you can minimize or maybe even completely reduce your avalanche risk by using appropriate terrain. Now, at one end of the continuum, we can think about not going into avalanche terrain at all. You know, we can think about abstinence. And we know from other risky decision-making processes that teaching abstinence simply doesn't work. So teaching people how to manage their terrain to reduce their risk is really the way that we want to move forward. And what we're doing is taking what's called a geospatial view on that process. And our idea and the way that we try to frame this is that your track in the backcountry, be that on ski, be that on snowmobile, be that snowshoeing, hiking, heli-assisted, be that extreme snow angeling, whatever you want to be doing, but that track is an expression of the sum of all your choices. And the idea behind the work that we've been doing is to say, well, we don't necessarily understand every single one of those choices, but maybe by looking at your track really carefully, we might be able to understand a few of those choices and back calculate based on some other attributes why and who and where and when you made the choices that you did. And sometimes when we look at track data, and here's an example from Wyoming, this is just in Teton National Park, we can see a pretty clear idea about where someone was going. They had a pretty clear objective. We could see where they went up, we could see where they went down. We've also had some survey data that told us who they were with, and we get a pretty clear understanding around the decisions that informed why they went there and where they moved in that terrain. At other times, we're left going around in circles. And this is, if you're seeing it now, it's just pulling up on people's screens, I can see. This is an example of a snowmobile track. So in this particular case, we can see straight away that it's a snowmobile track. Skiers don't tend to leave tracks like this. But again, when we combine that with information on who they are and who they're with, we start getting some ideas around the purpose of the day, and we can extract their risk profile as a function of that. The other thing that we're trying to do is trying to understand terrain use and decision making from the perspective of success. So a lot of previous work has looked at accident analyses, and accidents can tell us a huge amount about what went wrong. But typically accidents are from a series of events. They're not typically just from one poor decision. They're this cascade of situations. We've often seen this analogy of the Swiss cheese, where we have 5 or 6 or 7 slices of cheese with holes. Swiss cheese, traditional Swiss cheese has the holes, or the Emmentaler. And to get a fatal accident, you typically need to have passed through a number of those holes and multiple slices of cheese. So our thinking is that while it's important to look at decision-making or decision-making that led in very negative outcomes, it's also really important to look at good decision-making and see what we can find, how different groups of people make decisions in the backcountry, and how we can tease out the groups that are making better decisions relative to the current conditions, and maybe those that are making riskier decisions, and understand why and when those risky decisions are being made. So we're trying to understand the reasons and patterns of risky behavior. And really our ultimate goal in this is to develop targeted education that identifies the groups, the settings, the types of people, the locations, maybe the cultures where we are getting increased risky behavior, so that we can do some type of intervention, do some form of learning, so that we can really try and tackle the number of avalanche fatalities and prevent people from making poor decisions in the future. This is part of the White Heat Project, this work. Not all of it's been part of the White Heat Project, but it forms part of this wider umbrella where we're trying to understand decision-making and risky behavior in the backcountry. And some of the key questions that we're asking are the who, the when, the where, and the why. So, you know, a lot of this is fairly straightforward, but we've got a lot of unknowns here. So let's have a look at how we can do this. So we've used 4 key different approaches to understand how people use terrain. And each of those methods have got their own pros and cons, and we'll go through what they are. And they provide us with slightly different sets of data. So one of the projects that Robin mentioned right at the beginning was the ski tracks project. This is our first attempt that we took at understanding decision-making, real-world decision-making in the backcountry by groups of individuals. This is where we use crowdsourced data. People would submit their data via a smartphone app. First we used a GPS device and then migrated to a smartphone app. And then also send us some information about who they were. We also tried some intercept surveys. This is the work by John Sykes, and I'll talk about that in a second. We've used some passive monitoring using time-lapse cameras. And then finally, we've also been doing some work with Andrea and the White Heat group, looking at hypothetical choice. And that also is a way to look at terrain use through a hypothetical lens, where you can maybe control for some of these other factors and reduce the degrees of freedom that we're trying to deal with in terms of the real world data. So just looking at the ski tracks data, this is just a quick schematic of what's going on with our ski tracks data. I think a lot of people have probably heard me talk about this or have mentioned this project in the past. But the basic idea was that we were asking people, when they went out in the backcountry, to record where they went using a GPS-enabled device, typically a smartphone. We suggested using the Ski Tracks app because it works, it was pretty good on battery power, and it gave us the sort of data that was easily shared to us. People would send us that data, we would then analyze that data, and we would come up with a series of terrain metrics that we would try and use to enumerate or get an expression of risk from their terrain use. When we received their track, we would also send them a survey. And that survey was really, really important because I think it's really important to look at how people move in the terrain, but you need to put that in the context of who they're with, why they were there, what their motivations are, and bring that together to provide us with a lens or at least some insight into decision making. We published some of this work back in 2016, and a lot of these papers are available to the public as open access. So if people are interested to read more, please take a look at some of these works. But just some themes. We saw that gender was important. We saw that avalanche education was important. And we also saw that group size and group composition was important. And what I mean by group composition is that we saw that people in different types of groups under the same snow and avalanche conditions, i.e. under the same backcountry avalanche advisories, were using the terrain very, very differently. Project that we worked on, and this is of John's master's degree, was an intercept survey approach. So the benefit of an intercept survey approach is that
there, and just to interrupt there, Jordy, is there someone in your room?
Nobody in my room. Muted. Thank you. So the other approach we used to look at terrain use was this intercept survey approach. And as I was saying, this was some of John Sykes's master's thesis work. So John, in this particular photo, is standing at the boundary of the Bridger Bowl ski area to the backcountry. And he's asking people a few questions about who they are, what they're doing, what their experience is like. And he's asking them to carry a GPS. So those two data sets together provide us with an insight about who you are, where you're going, and some insight into your decision-making processes. And when we go and have a look at his data, and I would encourage you to take a look at his paper if you want to read more, we saw that gender, avalanche education, and people's perception around how that terrain, that backcountry terrain, was controlled. Some people believe because it's adjacent to the ski area that there's still some avalanche mitigation happening, which there isn't. So what we saw is that those three factors were important in determining how people chose terrain, what their terrain preferences were, and how they made decisions. And these are just some summary plots on the right-hand side. These are these heat maps that show basically the density of usage in those areas from John's intercept survey data. The third approach we used, and this was from another project by a master's student, Diana Sally. Diana is an avalanche forecaster with Avalanche Canada these days. And again, take a look at her paper if you want to read more. This was a really innovative project using a time-lapse camera that would take photos every 10 seconds and then basically do a change detection where changes represented movement of people as black dots, these little pixels that were moving from photo to photo to photo. And the shot that you're seeing there in the background is an example from 2016 where we had an avalanche that occurred while the camera was on. And we can see the lines, we can see the crown line from the avalanche, we can see the powder cloud just going off a cliff band at the bottom of Saddle Peak. Again, this is adjacent to Bridger Bowl ski area in Montana here. And you can see the different colored dots with the lines. And those lines represent the position change from timestamp 1 to timestamp 2. And using over 31,000 images, she managed to understand and look at how different backcountry avalanche advisories influence the point density of where skiers were. So she used over 32,000 images, 7,499 skier data points, and compared those to different avalanche advisories. So again, we can see that people's terrain, in this case, is changing as a function of the backcountry avalanche advisory. So for those of you that are forecasters out there, those of you that are producing backcountry avalanche advisories, this I think is a very positive outcome. We would like to think that people modify their behavior as a function of the avalanche advisory, and certainly in this case study, they did. The final area that we've been looking into are these hypothetical choices. And this is some of the work we've been doing under the White Heat Project with Andrea Mansberg, Marcus Landro, and also Stefan, looking at how we might choose, how we might prefer or accept different choices around terrain in a hypothetical case when we have a given snow and avalanche conditions. And what we see in this work is that our attitudes and perceptions predict our hypothetical choices in terms of what we would prefer to ski under the given scenario. But also really interestingly, and Andrea has already mentioned this, is that, you know, maybe what we accept to ski is different to what we would prefer to ski. So the role and the influence of the peer group, the people we're with, and what decisions are happening around us. So this gives us some more insight into why we make decisions that we do and what that results in terms of the terrain. So it's kind of looking the other way at how we use terrain. So if I think about those 4 different approaches, and we think about how we use terrain and how we make decisions there, we can look at the why, we can look at the where, we can look at the number of people we sample, and we can start looking at how this all comes together. So for our crowdsourced ski tracks data, we have pretty good data on where people were. We collected a good number of tracks. We had over 4,000 tracks. Not all of those were usable to us because we didn't have all of the survey data to us. We have some idea about who those people are. We don't have an amazing understanding of the why. The why still, by and large, eludes us because we don't have a microchip inside everybody's head. We can't understand every single piece of decision making. We're really just inferring key decisions from the terrain that you're using. If we look at the Intercept survey approach, we get a pretty good understanding about where, we get a pretty good understanding about the why, but our numbers are limited. And our scope of inference is also limited because, unfortunately, we don't have unlimited resources. We can't put thousands of people out at every trailhead doing these types of intercept surveys. So we get a biased survey as a function of where we're standing and the cohort, the culture of the groups that are in that area. If we think about our time-lapse approach, I think this is a really exciting way to passively document where people and how people are moving in terrain. I also think it has some real benefits in terms of operational safety. And in fact, one of the things, the partnerships that we've developed here in Montana is having Bridger Bowl use that to, in the case of an avalanche in the backcountry there, to look at the data, to go back in those images and use it to help guide a rescue scenario so they could see the number of people that were maybe involved in an avalanche. So it also has a tracking capacity as well as maybe an emergency response and rescue capacity. And then in terms of our hypothetical choices, again, because we use a survey approach, we can get pretty far into the numbers. We can get a lot of people to engage in this process. We get a pretty good understanding about the why, and we also have a pretty good understanding about the who, but we don't really have a good understanding about the where because it is a hypothetical choice, and it's really a measure of how we're looking at our risk preferences. Some general themes from all of this is that gender, avalanche education, perception and mitigation, regional danger, and group factors are important about how we make decisions and how we move in our terrain. However, I think the piece that we need to really stop and think about is that terrain is not exactly equal to risk. Avalanche risk is the probability of harm from an interaction between people avalanche hazard, and specific elements at risk. Avalanche risk is determined by the exposure of those elements, vulnerability to the avalanche hazard. And that's something that Grant wrote in an ISSW paper a number of years ago. And you've probably seen this figure here, where avalanche hazard and vulnerability and exposure equals our avalanche risk. We can obtain the avalanche hazard, or at least at a regional scale, from the avalanche advisories where they're present. And most of our data is from areas where we have avalanche advisories. And really what we're trying to measure is this exposure component. So what does someone's exposure look like? And how does that exposure change as a function of who they're with, where they're going, and what the conditions are? And that then gives us a sense about that avalanche risk. So a key component to that is using it in terms of backcountry avalanche terrain. So one way we can go about doing that is connecting it to terrain and risk. And borrowing from the Canadian Avalanche Association, this is a table in the technical aspects of snow avalanche risk mitigation. It's a fantastic resource that I encourage you all to take a look at. There's this ATES, which is the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale Experience Risk Matrix. It's used for operational professional use. And this basically shows that as we head towards that bottom right-hand corner, we have increasing risk. So by combining an assessment of terrain with the local avalanche forecast, with someone's skill set, we can start getting at what people's risk actually looks like. So using a very similar framework, we could use our tracks, and we've compared this with our tracks on some ATES mapping to what people's skill sets are, to understand what their objective risk is versus what their subjective risk is, which is what their assessments were of the risk on that given day. And it's a broad brush approach, but it does allow us to start seeing the types of groups, the types of settings where we have increased risk from certain types of groups moving in the back. The challenge with that is that ATES is not mapped everywhere. However, this is also an area that we're working towards. This screenshot here is from a new product that was recently released in Norway. It shows it's a modified ATES called the CAST mapping. This was led by NVE, the National Avalanche Forecasting Service in Norway, and Halvard Larsen, who led this project. And what you can see here is kind of a broad scale ATES map for a section of Norway. They have this now for all of Norway. And you also have a route there that's shown that has a ATES classification for the route. And this is done for planning purposes, so you can get a sense of the seriousness of the terrain that you're heading into. So we now also have a beta version of this running for most forecast regions in North America. And using the combination of wide-scale terrain mapping with these various ways of measuring terrain, we're starting to understand how and where people move in the backcountry and what their relative risk profiles are. There's some ongoing development in this area that we're really excited about, and I would encourage you to take a look at the poster session. There's a poster there called Development of an Automated Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale Maps, Current and Future. Please go and have a look at all the posters, but especially take a look at that if you're interested in ATES and where we're moving to in that. But I'm really excited about using this as a framework to understand how our terrain and what our resulting risk profiles are by our real world terrain usage. And then there's also been some development, and Grant Statham, I've seen him in the attendees here, I can speak to this. There's also been some development of updating and going towards an ATES version 2 that redefines some of those categories of the exposure of the avalanche terrain exposure scale and how that changes in the terrain. So just looking at our key elements of the data that we have so far, we have observed terrain use. So if we think about our avalanche triangle, that tells us something about how people move in that terrain. It also tells us a bit about the weather. Certain types of terrain are more favorable under certain weather conditions. We obviously don't want to be using ridge terrain if it's blowing at 100 kilometers per hour. So looking at terrain use by groups tells us a bit about what conditions they're under as well. Also tells a little bit about the snowpack. We also get snowpack information when we look at the regional avalanche advisories. So we can pull that information together as well. We also get some information about groups and individuals. People do surveys as part of most of our terrain use data collection. And that gives us information about our human factors. And our hypothetical choices also informs us around human factors. And that's obviously the central part of our snow, weather, terrain, avalanche triangle. And our AITS mapping is critically important there to try and provide a quantification of our risk. So, what are we moving towards in the future? Well,
you're moving towards a conclusion, I hope, because you're running out of time, Jordy.
I am indeed. We are looking at combining our real world tracks with our hypothetical choices by overlaying what people said they would do within some of our surveys and how that looks in terms of our avalanche terrain. So we can look at what someone said in a hypothetical choice versus what they actually did in the backcountry setting. And that really allows us, I believe, to understand the who, where, and why of decision making in avalanche terrain. So I just want to leave everybody with something to think about. The next time you're standing up on a mountain slope, thinking about where you might go, think about how your group, how your setting, how your location influences the choices you make and the terrain that you use. And what would your track say about your decision making? What would it say about the influence of your group? And what would it say about your risk tolerance? And the next time you go out into the backcountry as a professional or as a recreationalist, think about the line you leave on the snow and in the mountains and what that says about your objective and your subjective risk and whether that could be a better line if you were to do it again in the future, and how we can use our lines and our track to influence culture to make good decisions, to be safe in the mountains, and to all come home safely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordy. Very interesting topic and very important to this community. And I think that all dovetails really well with the previous talks and how do we improve people's decision making in the terrain, which is the most important part of avalanche safety. Okay, we have time for one question. Do we have any questions from the floor or the community? Anybody have a question?
Yes, we have one question on the floor from Eric View. Go ahead, Eric. Eric, you'll have to unmute yourself to ask the question. We'll give you one more opportunity. Unmute, Eric, and ask your question. Just a reminder to folks out there, if you are asking a verbal question, please check your mic settings or preferences, depending on what type of computer you're running on. It may be muted in the GoToWebinar platform, or it could be something on your computer settings itself, whether you're using headphones or have removed them and using your computer speaker. Seems that a couple folks here can't unmute themselves. So we could just take a look at that before you come on to ask the question. We have no more questions from the floor.
Okay, so any mail-in questions or text questions? Okay, unfortunately, you burned up all your time there, Jordy, but it was very interesting. And we just want to thank you from all of us here in Fernie for participating in the virtual snow science workshop and your contribution to this event and to avalanche research and education in general. Thank you, Jordy.
Thanks for having me on. Have a great morning.
Awesome. Okay, well, moving on, we have next up Kyle Hamilton and Alex Hansen. Good morning, gentlemen. Kyle
Morning.
and Alex. Kyle and Alex are both right here in beautiful Fernie, BC. And did I tell you how precious it is out the window here right now? It's just unbelievable. Kyle came to Fernie in 2006, and he has been eking out a living here as a successful photographer and entrepreneur. A few years back, Kyle created the I Am Fernie project, which was offered free portraits to anyone in town. The result, thousands of portraits and a spectacular visual reference to the people of the town of Fernie. It was remarkable. Check it out at iamfernie.com. Kyle is an avid outdoor enthusiast and captures many stunning backcountry images. Alex, also here in Fernie, he is a filmer and sledder. Alex has put together a number of snowmobiling films through his media companies. Alex is a qualified blaster and works in the mining sector in the valley here as a blaster. Today, their topic, using immersive experience for hazard identification training. This is still in the development stage, but they will present to us today visual tools for the avalanche industry that can be used in a variety of virtual educational settings. And they will be looking for collaborators and experts in the avalanche education field to help guide them in their development of these virtual products. So strap on your Oculus virtual reality goggles and let's go for a ride with Kyle and Alex. Gentlemen.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction, Robin. So yeah, today our presentation is going to talk a little bit about who we are, our startup company, Sucra Interactive, give you a general overview of the value of training in a virtual reality environment and how we see it being applied to snow safety training and avalanche awareness training. The effectiveness of immersive training is well established, but since COVID-19 especially, it's becoming more relevant than ever. We believe this is the way forward to continue with the classroom component of backcountry education. And since we're unable to meet in person, we're unable to put you into a headset to give you the full experience, but we do have a screen capture video to give you a little bit of a sense of what it's like. As well as Robin mentioned, we are by no means experts in avalanche awareness or identification. And so as we're presenting, if you have any thoughts, feedback, or ideas on how you might be interested in implementing this with your project, we'd love to hear from you. So yeah, quick little synopsis. My background, moved to Fernie from Saskatchewan a number of years ago, and growing up in the flatlands and the prairies definitely took a while to understand and appreciate what avalanches and the risks associated were. I've worked around BC with a number of different cat and heli operations, and so all of my education has really come from talking to people and being in different environments. Over to you, Alex.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Hansen, and as Robin suggested, I'm a freelance backcountry cinematographer and a Transport Canada certified advanced drone pilot. And mostly what I do in the backcountry is extreme snowmobile content. So I'm one of those drivers that Andrea was talking about in terms of potentially pushing risk on other folks. As far as safety skills, I'm currently trained to AST level 2 through Avalanche Canada. And as Robin mentioned, I work in the mining sector. I'm also a certified mine rescue team member and a blaster at one of the local tech mines in British Columbia. So Basically, I handle explosives and provide on-call fire rescue service at a mine site for about half of my life, and then the other half of my life is flying robots, operating cameras, and acting as emergency response and first aid on all of our backcountry shoots. So I spend a lot of time in the mountains. Education is good. Could always use a little bit more myself, so I attend a lot of the snow workshops that have been going on in Fernie in the lead up to the ISSW. So I recognize the need for safety training in high-risk work environments, especially in backcountry travel. And so we've co-founded a new company, Sucra Interactive Technologies, and we're going to be focusing on immersive learning. And I definitely think there's a component to backcountry education.
Sorry, 2 seconds. I just realized my computer wasn't plugged in. All right, so yes, our company, Sucra Interactive Technologies, we are just a startup, and we are building this tool primarily for working in mining and other high hazard industries. However, we quickly recognized the potential value for this in avalanche terrain identification and other hazard awareness in backcountry settings. So we're going to kick it back over to Brent to start up the video, and Alex will walk you through what we've developed so far.
Okay.
You're good to speak there, Alex.
Finally got unmuted there. Okay, so we did do some filming in Avalanche Canada assessed terrain. This is north of Elkford and Cocoa Claims here in the BC Rockies. We're also working on a component of pre-trip planning. Obviously, having a good plan before you leave the backcountry is definitely part of the safety scenario. So we're able to use the avalanche.ca website, and kind of we're working on utilizing the risk reduction tools. This is more focused for snowmobilers who may, in some cases, travel a lot more in the backcountry in terms of access to terrain. You can go a lot further and faster on a snowmobile. So yeah, all kinds of stuff on the website. There's also a component here of staging where we can start to teach people group dynamics. I'm actually doing a transceiver check here, and Joe didn't have his on for the shoot, which is quite interesting. So always good to make sure that everybody's got their transceiver on. Here's the next scene. We were talking about using the evaluator tool in the avalanche terrain exposure scale map, and we could talk about the use of different tools. Again, more group dynamics here. So we're just moving the camera around, the headset around. These are screenshots from inside of a headset. You don't get the 3D experience, but again, you can see at a key decision point, you know, what do the cornices look like? Does the weather match what the forecast said? Again, talking about making decisions and teaching people how to make correct decisions is one of the plans. And finally, here we've reached our planned destination. As you can see, we're completely surrounded by multiple hazards. But the view certainly is incredible here in the BC Rockies. This is about 60 kilometers north of where we're at right now in Fernie. Just amazing terrain on the Continental Divide. Pretty stunning. But again, I put people in those positions immersively. And then, of course, who doesn't like a good quiz? Here we are talking about matching danger rating. Some of this stuff is fairly simple for a lot of you folks who are pretty advanced in your education. But I think in terms of providing basic education and testing regimes and feedback to folks on what they know and what they don't know, and areas that they can focus in on, just a basic snapshot of what's possible with immersive technology. So I'll hand you back to Kyle.
Thanks. So, question we're often asked is why use virtual reality? It's our current training systems already work. Why do we need to utilize new technology? Our answer is we're not trying to replace the current training, the current techniques, everything. Virtual reality is there to help augment them. Virtual reality is also not new. It has changed quite rapidly, even in the last 2 or 3 years, the technology available. Previous iterations of virtual reality environments were very graphical environments. They were video games. Whereas now with advances in technology, we're able to capture film live action scenes in a 360-degree environment with 3D depth of field included in the viewing process. And this just really helps to create a much more immersive experience when you put the headset on. So what's the advantages of immersive training? A lot of academic research that's been academically led and industry led is showing the tremendous benefits of virtual reality training. If you think of it like an elite athlete doing visualization before a big event, putting somebody into an immersive environment allows them to visualize and experience the situation without having to be exposed to all the hazards and dangers of being in that location. Learning through experience is the best education, and using an immersive environment helps create better, more vivid memories. Memories are what help rapid recall of data. So some statistics available through a lot of the research. Experiential learning creates 75 to 90% higher data retention. 35 to 40% of individuals who undergo immersive training have an increase in their confidence in their understanding and ability to act on these learnings. Learners are 3.75 times more likely to become emotionally connected to the content than just a traditional classroom setting. And perhaps the most important for high hazard situations is that 75% of learners experience a wake-up call moment. So that's kind of that aha, oh yeah, okay, this is serious. This can kill me or seriously hurt me. Another portion or reason for using virtual reality training is costs. So a quick cost breakdown is course costs $350 for a 2-day course. That's if you happen to live within an hour's drive or live close by. You can easily start adding on travel and accommodation, costs for missed work, and repeating the course throughout over the course of the winter so that you maintain the freshness of the information. With a virtual reality system, you'll have about a $400 upfront cost to purchase the hardware, and then hypothetically $100 to use the course, to get the course into your headset, and you can use it multiple times. Back over to you, Alex.
So a little bit on the data side, we're not just talking about using immersive experiences to teach people on the front end. The learning is, in fact, a two-way street. So one of the things we're developing on the back end is a digital platform to capture all of the testing data for competency-based certification. So learning management system, pretty standard in most heavy industries and their training departments. We think that this concept of a learning management system can be brought into the backcountry safety world quite easily. And this means that organizations in the various countries that participate in handing out certification for Avalanche awareness training can access the learning data to certify based on competency-based testing, sort of like what we saw in the demo. So imagine getting educated through immersive learning, being able to repeat the course 4 to 5 times or more during a season to, as Kyle said, stay really fresh with the material, and refining that knowledge through multiple sessions and receive competency-based certification for your selected course. So pretty exciting times, I think, in terms of what the learning potentials are for immersive experiences, and we are looking for industry partners to help us to develop these platforms. So if you're interested, you can contact us through the ISSW team. Thank you.
And that's essentially the gist of our presentation. We've tried to keep it as short and sweet as possible to allow for much time for questions and any feedback or thoughts on directions that you'd like to see this go.
Wow, this is just incredible, you guys. Can't believe this. So realistic. Oh, there's a command. Okay, well, thank you very much, Kyle. You guys, that was an incredible presentation, and I think futuristic view of Avalanche education, and the potential is pretty much unlimited. As AI and 3D technologies continue to advance, I'm sure this concept will gain some traction. I just want to thank you from all of us at the VSSW for your participation. And yeah, we have time for a few questions. Any questions from the floor?
We have a question from the floor from Eric Yu. Go ahead, Eric. Hi, Eric. We had a question from the floor from you. Maybe you put your hand up inadvertently. We're going to cancel that. And do we have any more questions from the floor? We have a question from the chat box.
Yes, this question is coming in from Ron. Do you have an on-mountain decision-making exercise? Is there evidence of better training retention with virtual reality? And are there similar physiological reactions like HRRR, hand, palm, sweating with VR as in reality?
Yes, to all of those. Just trying to recall all the. First question was about an on-mountain decision-making component. Yes, we have that. We're developing that. That is the crux of what we're wanting to build and develop. The question about the physiological response. Yes, it's not necessarily every individual is going to respond the same way, just like in real life on the side of the mountain. But you can track a lot of those physiological responses. That starts getting into some ethical issues when you start looking at the biometric feedback that is still trying to be worked out by the ethicists, and how you track that data and how you respond to that data. But yeah, there is a lot of data out there about how the human body reacts in a virtual reality environment, and the thought process that you go through.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope that answered your question, Ron.
Yeah, but no more audio questions from the floor.
We have one more coming in from the chat box. This one's from Eva. Thanks, Kyle. How long do you think till this technology will become inclusive past the early adoption phase?
That's a really good question. We don't really have can't say as I have a solid answer for that. It's something that is being deployed in a lot of large corporations. It's certainly gaining more and more traction in industry. What the time frame is for everyday users to start adopting it, it's tough to really put a date to that, but it's happening faster and faster with industry.
Awesome. And then one more question from the chat box. This one is from Steve Scott. This would be amazing for immersive terrain travel learning. An overlay of slope angles while traveling through virtual terrain. Oh, sorry, question just disappeared. An overlay of slope angles while traveling through virtual terrain would be really cool. Would that be possible?
Yeah, that's completely possible in terms of the virtual environment. But I think later on in the future, what's going to be really interesting is the notion of augmented reality. So a pair of glasses that you're putting on, or potentially ski goggles with a heads-up display that's actually showing you real-time information based on the terrain that you're actually in connection with global internet connection. So the future is pretty interesting. I think in terms of slope angles and decision-making, graphics, overlays inside of virtual reality, all of that stuff is possible right now.
Any more questions? All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Okay, that pretty much wraps up this program for this morning's session. I want to thank all of our presenters again for participating in this virtual snow science workshop. All of those tied together really well, and that research and products will give us hopefully a better understanding of how people make decisions in the terrain, which is, in my view, the most important aspect of traveling in backcountry. I would like to thank our again for sponsoring this session. And at that point, I guess, looking around, there's nothing else for me. Thank you very much for tuning into this morning's session. And I'll pass this back to James. Thanks. Oh man, I need a cigarette or something.
Thanks very much, Robin. Robin comes under the headings sometimes of do not try this at home. Thanks again to all the speakers in the first session. We're going to take a break now. One of the salient points from some of those sessions was something the ISSW committee has been wrestling with, and that's really the question of how far technology can take us, and when we need to turn back to the tangible elements of our life, such as in-person meetings, training, and real world experiences. So I really appreciate the thought-provoking discussions that we've had in all of the last talks in the session. One thing for the break that Brent mentioned previously, please check your microphone settings, see if you can make sure that you have a microphone connected. And when you rejoin the session, you can use the audio section in the webinar controls and try and run a little sound check in that section there. That will prepare you for when you would like to jump into a question. And that will be very pertinent for the next session, which is our panel discussion. And that will be entitled Next Level Professionalism, Integrating Professional Snowmobilers with Established Snow and Avalanche Communities. So we'll shut this down now, and you will have to rejoin the webinar by clicking on the Go to Live link in the presentation website. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you at 10:30.